Nome, Alaska, winter of 1996, was not the kind of winter people prepare for. It was the kind that arrives early, stays quiet at first, and then slowly closes every door you thought you had. By late October, the Bering Sea had already begun to stiffen at the edges, the kind of early freeze that old dock workers noticed but didn't talk much about. The wind came low and constant, scraping along the ground instead of howling, and that was always the first sign something was wrong. Planes still landed then, but less often. Supplies arrived late. Radios started repeating the same warnings over and over, telling people to stock food, check fuel, and be ready to leave if evacuation orders came. Nome had seen hard winters before, but this one carried a different weight. Snow didn't fall gently. It came sideways, driven by wind strong enough to erase tracks within minutes. By November, temperatures dropped below -20 at night, and the daylight felt thin and useless, barely lifting the grey from the horizon. Houses creaked, engines failed. People stopped walking and started hurrying, eyes down, shoulders tight, as if the cold itself were watching. Most of the town trusted their homes. Wood frames, oil heaters, electric lines strung across frozen ground, systems that had worked before. But a few older residents remembered storms, where heat vanished faster than fear, where wind pushed cold through walls like water through cloth. As forecasts worsened, families began packing. Some left early, boarding the last reliable flights south. Others planned to ride it out, believing the storm would pass like the others had. Every winter carries that gamble. Nome was no different. But this time, the cold deepened fast. Power flickered. Fuel deliveries slowed. The harbour froze solid weeks earlier than expected, trapping boats in place like fossils. Emergency notices went out warning that rescue would not be guaranteed once the storm fully arrived. On the edge of town, where the ground dipped toward permafrost and the wind ran unobstructed from the sea, lived a man most people barely noticed. His name was Caleb Rowe, 29 years old. Dock labourer when work was steady, snow clearing when it wasn't. He didn't own much, no truck worth mentioning, no family in town, no house anyone would envy. When neighbours talked about evacuation plans or reinforced windows, Caleb wasn't part of the conversation. While others measured firewood and checked furnaces, he did something that looked wrong to anyone watching. He picked a patch of frozen ground behind his small rented structure, took a shovel and a pry bar, and started digging. People assumed he was preparing a cellar, or maybe trying to bury something before the ground locked completely. But day after day, the hole got deeper. He worked in short shifts, 6 hours at most, stopping when the cold began to dull his hands. He didn't fight the earth. He listened to it, stopping before the permafrost hardened into stone. By the end of the first week, the pit was already deeper than his height from the waist down. Someone joked that he was digging his own grave. Someone else laughed and said no one survives underground in Alaska. Caleb didn't answer. He hauled driftwood from the shoreline, scavenged bent metal sheets from abandoned fishery sheds, and dragged them across the snow alone. There was no generator, no concrete truck, no blueprint, just quiet work done carefully while the sky darkened earlier each day. By the time the first major blizzard warning was issued, the hole behind his place no longer looked like a mistake. It looked intentional. Still, no one understood it. When the wind picked up and the temperature fell past -30, Nome began to close in on itself. Flights stopped completely. Roads disappeared under drifts taller than doorways. Emergency services shifted into survival mode. And then, one morning, the storm arrived with full force. Whiteout conditions swallowed the town. Roofs groaned. Radio calls stacked up unanswered. Somewhere in that chaos, Caleb Rowe vanished. No lights, no smoke, no footprints leading anywhere. By nightfall, even the neighbors closest to him assumed the same thing everyone always assumes in the Arctic when silence takes over, that the cold had claimed another name. Caleb Rowe did not believe houses failed because the cold was too strong. He believed they failed because they stood in the wrong place and fought the wrong enemy. Growing up, he had watched small structures outlast bigger ones, and low shelters stay warmer than tall homes that caught the wind. Older men along the docks used to say the same thing every winter: wind kills faster than cold. Caleb listened. He didn't have money for reinforced walls or backup generators, and even if he had, he didn't trust systems that depended on power lines stretching across frozen ground. When the storm warnings came in 1996, he didn't think about leaving. He thought about shape, depth, and silence. The digging was the hardest part. The ground above permafrost is deceptive, soft for a while, then suddenly unyielding. Caleb stopped at 4.5 feet, right where the earth still held a steady temperature. He shaped the pit by hand, sloping the walls inward so the pressure of snow would push down, not collapse inward. Each night he covered the opening with tarps to keep frost from locking the soil solid before morning. By the 5th day, his shoulders burned constantly, and his fingers cracked open despite layers of gloves. He kept going anyway, knowing that once the storm arrived, there would be no fixing mistakes. The frame went in next. Driftwood beams, salt-hardened from years in the Bering Sea, were laid across the pit and braced at the corners. 2 curved whale jaw fragments, leftovers from older shoreline finds, formed the main roof ribs, reinforced with bent steel pipe scavenged from a rusted storage shed. It wasn't elegant, but it was strong, and strength mattered more than appearance. Over the ribs, he layered corrugated metal sheets, overlapping them so meltwater would never drip inside. The shelter began to disappear even before the snow arrived, sinking visually into the ground as if it had always belonged there. Insulation came from whatever could trap still air. Sawdust collected from a closed workshop, ash from burned scrap wood, old canvas tarps that smelled of oil and salt. He packed these layers carefully, building thickness instead of height. The outermost layer was snow itself, shoveled and compressed by hand until it hardened into a dense shell. Snow wasn't the enemy here. It was the barrier. Once packed, it stopped wind completely and held warmth the way Earth does. The entrance was a vertical drop hatch, offset from the main chamber, and turned at a right angle so no wind could rush straight in. When closed, it sealed tight enough that sound from outside vanished almost completely. Inside, Caleb kept things simple: a low, sleeping platform built from scrap wood, a single kerosene lamp placed where heat could rise and spread slowly across the ceiling, 2 narrow vent pipes, one low, one high, bent at sharp angles to prevent heat loss and snow blockage. He tested the system at night, lighting the lamp and sitting still, watching the frost form outside while the air inside stayed calm. After 3 hours, the temperature stabilized in the mid-60s. That was enough. More than enough. People passing by in those final days before the storm didn't see a shelter. They saw a mound of snow and scrap half buried near the edge of town. Someone said he was wasting time. Someone else said metal would freeze him faster than wood. No one realized that the structure was already finished, already sealed, already waiting. When the first full whiteout hit and the wind erased the last visible edges of the build, Caleb climbed down into the shelter, closed the hatch above him, and let the storm bury the world he no longer needed to see. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built itself layer by layer, hour by hour, until Nome no longer felt like a town, but like something being slowly erased. Wind speeds climbed past 50 miles per hour, driving snow so hard it stung exposed skin in seconds. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Houses vanished behind moving walls of white. Emergency radios crackled continuously. Reports of collapsed roofs, stalled vehicles, people trapped between buildings they could no longer see. The temperature dropped below -30, and with the wind, the cold pressed against structures like weight. Power failed in sections, then across entire blocks. Oil heaters choked as vents iced over. What had been uncomfortable became dangerous, fast. By the second night, rescue operations were already strained. Crews moved only when they had to, roped together to avoid losing one another in the whiteout. Calls came in from the outskirts first, isolated homes where fuel ran out or walls gave way under drifting snow. When Caleb Rowe's address appeared on the list, no one was surprised. He lived too far from the center of town, in a low area where drifts stacked deep and wind had nothing to slow it. A team pushed out as conditions allowed, following landmarks they knew by memory more than sight. What they found was nothing that looked like a house, no standing walls, no door, no roofline, just uneven snow hardened by wind into ridges and slopes. They searched for signs, smoke, a vent, anything that broke the surface. There was nothing. The drifts were already 7 feet deep in places, packed so tightly they rang when struck with a shovel. With visibility dropping again, and another surge of wind coming in from the sea, the team made a decision they had made too many times already that week. They marked the location as lost and moved on. There were still people calling for help who could be seen, who could be reached. You don't argue with a storm like this. You accept what it takes. Word spread quietly through Nome the next day. Caleb Rowe hadn't made it. No one said it out loud at first, but everyone understood what the absence of tracks and smoke meant in that cold. Another name added to the list forming in people's minds, even before official numbers were released. The storm didn't slow. Snow continued to bury what little remained above ground. The town retreated inward, focusing on survival, on keeping the living alive. Outside, the wind scoured the landscape smooth, erasing the last visible sign that anything had ever been built there at all. Beneath that silence, under layers of packed snow and frozen earth, Caleb sat in the dark with the kerosene lamp turned low. The sound of the storm reached him only as a distant pressure, a dull vibration through the walls. Inside the shelter, the air was still. The temperature held steady in the mid-60s. He measured time by the fuel he burned and the marks he scratched into the metal wall. He did not know that search teams had stood above him. He did not know he had already been counted among the dead. All he knew was that the wind had stopped touching him, and that as long as it stayed outside, he would still be there when the storm finally let go. Inside the shelter, time stopped behaving the way it does on the surface. There was no daylight to mark mornings, no wind noise to signal when the storm intensified or eased. The world above existed only as pressure, snow settling, ice shifting, the faint groan of metal as temperatures plunged and rose, by degrees too small to feel. Caleb learned quickly that survival underground was less about strength and more about restraint. He kept the lamp turned low, just bright enough to see his hands and the edge of the sleeping platform. Heat was precious, but stillness was more important. The less air he disturbed, the more stable the space became. The snow did exactly what he had counted on. As it piled higher, the temperature inside the shelter grew steadier, not colder. The packed layers outside absorbed the wind and locked it away, turning chaos into insulation. Caleb checked the vents by touch, feeling for airflow with his fingers, clearing frost only when he had to. Too much adjustment would leak heat. Too little would starve the air. He moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy the way animals do in winter. Meals were small and regular. Dried fish, rice softened with melted ice, strips of seal fat eaten for calories rather than comfort. He drank warm water whenever possible, knowing dehydration killed quietly in the cold. Sleep came in fragments, 4 hours at a time, sometimes less. When the storm roared hardest above, he lay still and listened, counting breaths until the sound faded back into a distant wait. At night, or what he assumed was night, he scratched a line into the metal wall, one mark for each cycle of rest and wakefulness. By the fifth mark, the outside temperature had dropped even further, but inside, the air hovered at 65 degrees. The shelter held. The design worked. What threatened him now wasn't cold, but isolation. Silence has its own pressure. It presses inward, making time feel heavier, stretching moments until they blur. On the surface, Nome was paying the price. Roofs collapsed under drifting snow. Emergency crews pulled people from unheated rooms, some too late. Fuel ran out. 23 deaths would eventually be counted across the region, most from exposure or structural failure. But Caleb did not know any of this. He knew only the small, controlled world he had built. When the lamp flickered low, he replaced the wick carefully, calculating how many days of fuel remained. When condensation froze along the metal walls, he chipped it loose and melted it for water. He spoke out loud sometimes, not to keep fear away, but to remind himself that his voice still existed. By the 8th day, the pressure above shifted. Snow settled instead of screaming past. The vibrations softened. The storm was losing its grip. Caleb waited anyway. Leaving too early could kill him faster than staying. When at last he climbed the ladder and pressed against the hatch from below, it didn't move. Snow had sealed it completely. He smiled once, quietly, because this was what the shelter was meant to do: disappear, endure, and wait. The first sign that the storm was truly over did not come as light or sound. It came as weight. The pressure above the shelter eased just enough for Caleb to feel the difference when he placed his hands against the hatch. Snow still sealed it shut, but it no longer felt alive. No shifting, no vibration, just mass. He waited another full cycle, burning almost no fuel, listening for movement that never returned. Patience mattered now more than speed. In the Arctic, rushing is how people die after they think they've survived. When he finally pushed upward, the hatch resisted for a moment, then cracked. Cold air spilled down the shaft in a sudden rush, sharp and clean, unlike the biting wind of the storm. Caleb shoveled slowly, lifting snow out in measured loads until his shoulders ached and his breath steamed thick in the opening. The sky above him was pale and empty, the kind of calm that only follows violence. He climbed out carefully, standing where no doorway should have existed, surrounded by drifts taller than his head. From a distance, someone saw movement. Recovery teams had begun sweeping the outskirts of town, marking damage and searching for bodies that might now be reachable. When they spotted a man standing alone in an open stretch of snow, they stopped, unsure of what they were seeing. There had been no structure on the map there anymore, no shelter, no sign of life for days. As they approached, the ground beneath their feet felt wrong, solid, hollow in places. When Caleb pointed down and brushed snow aside with his glove, the outline of metal appeared. A roof, a sealed structure buried exactly where the storm had left it. Word spread fast, not with celebration, but disbelief. A man presumed dead had been alive the entire time, living beneath the snow while the storm tore through the town above him. Officials asked questions. How long had he been down there? How did he breathe? Why hadn't anyone seen smoke? Caleb answered simply. He showed them the vents, the hatch, the layers. There was no drama in his explanation, no speech about bravery, just facts. By the end of the day, his name was removed from the list that had quietly grown during the storm. 23 others were not so lucky. As Nome began the slow work of digging out, Caleb packed what little he had left, sealed the shelter again, and walked back into town. The structure remained buried, invisible once more, proof that survival doesn't always look like strength, and that sometimes the safest place in a deadly winter is the one no one can see at all. When the official numbers were finally released, they were read quietly without ceremony. 23 dead across the region, most from exposure, some from structural failure. A few simply disappeared into the storm and were found too late. Nome returned to routine slowly, as Arctic towns always do after disaster. digging out roads, repairing roofs, restoring power, pretending that what happened was expected. Caleb Rowe's survival didn't become a headline. There were no cameras waiting for him, no interviews asking how it felt to cheat death. In a place like Nome, attention fades fast, and people are wary of stories that suggest the land can be outsmarted. Officials inspected the buried shelter once the area was safe. They took notes, measured temperatures, asked questions about materials and depth. Some shook their heads, others nodded but said nothing. No recommendation was ever made to copy the design. It didn't fit building codes. It didn't look safe. It didn't look like a home. What it was, instead, was an understanding of wind, of insulation, of how stillness can defeat force. Snow, which had killed so many above ground, had preserved warmth below. Earth, which people feared as frozen and hostile, had held a steady temperature when air could not. Caleb returned to dockwork when the harbour loosened its grip in spring. He didn't rebuild the shelter into something permanent. He left it sealed, buried, exactly as it had been during the storm. A few people asked him why he didn't expand it, improve it, make it better. He answered the same way each time. It had already done what it needed to do. The point was never to live underground forever. The point was to survive the moment when everything else failed. Years later, when people spoke about that winter, they talked about the wind, the darkness, the fear of losing heat in the middle of the night. They talked about who left and who stayed. Caleb's name came up sometimes, usually as an afterthought, a man who dug instead of running. But the lesson his shelter offered was larger than one storm or one town. In the Arctic, survival doesn't belong to the strongest walls or the loudest machines. It belongs to those who understand what to block, what to accept, and when to disappear until the danger passes. Long after the snow melted, the ground where Caleb had stood remained slightly raised, a subtle scar only visible if you knew where to look. Most people walked past it without noticing. That was fitting. The shelter was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be there when the world above decided without warning to turn deadly and to stay quiet long enough to outlast it.